Hello and welcome to my YouTube. This is Remembering the Year 1942. America went to war on December 8th, 1941. So, 1942 was Annus Horribilis, and if you don't speak Latin, that translates to a horrible year. The war was just beginning for America. We were losing badly. The Holocaust was happening in Europe. I'm not going to dwell on every battle or every horrible thing that happened during the year because I don't want to depress people so much that they'll stop watching this after a few minutes. Franklin D. Roosevelt was president in 1942. I wasn't born yet. It would be 2 more years before I was born in 1944. On January 1st, the declaration by United Nations is signed by China, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union, and 22 other nations, in which they agree, quote, not to make any separate peace with the Axis powers. We wanted to be sure that all of these allied countries stayed together and they didn't go off by themselves and try to make peace. On January 13th, Henry Ford patented a plastic automobile that would be 30% lighter than a conventional car. It never came to market as far as I know. On January 15th, the Sikorsky R-4 first flies. It became the first mass-produced helicopter in America, just in time for the war. On January 16th, American film actress Carole Lombard and her mother are among all 22 killed aboard a TWA Flight 3 when the Douglas DC-3 plane crashes into Potosi Mountain near Las Vegas. She was a huge star. Big story. On January 20th, the Nazis at the Wannsee Conference decide that the, quote, final solution to the, quote, Jewish problem is deportation to extermination camps. On January 21st, General Erwin Rommel launches his offensive in Africa, the Desert Fox, one of Germany's most brilliant and most successful generals. On January 25th, Thailand declares war on the United States and the United Kingdom. On January 26th, the first American forces arrive in Europe and they landed in Northern Ireland. But it would be a number of months before they actually engaged in combat. On February 1st, in the Marshall Gilbert raids, Admiral William Halsey sends airstrikes from the carrier USS Enterprise against the Marshall Islands. Fortunately, the USS Enterprise was not in the harbor in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked on December 7th. She was out at sea and came back to port later that night. So we had aircraft carriers. And February 1st, so this is a couple of months after Pearl Harbor, America begins to strike back. On February 1st, the German submarine fleet introduces the Enigma machine for U-boat communications, and this blinded the Allies' cryptoanalysts to their radio signals. So now these German submarines could receive their orders and send information about where they were as they were attacking the Allied shipping in the Atlantic. And it took a long time to finally break the Enigma machine codes. On February 3rd, daylight savings time goes into effect into the United States. And these are some of the posters. Mobilize an extra hour of daylight and help win the war. Saving daylight. Save 1 million tons of coal by using an extra hour of daylight. So it became a very patriotic thing to turn your clock forward. Finally, on February 8th, the top United States military leaders hold their first formal meeting to discuss American military strategy in the war. This is 2 months after Pearl Harbor. On February 9th, the ocean liner SS Normandy, which, by the way, we had taken from the French, it catches fire while it's being converted into a troop ship, the USS Lafayette, in New York City, and eventually it capsized the next day. On February 19th, the Japanese fleet bombs Darwin, Australia. On February 19th, President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, allowing the United States military to define areas as exclusionary zones. These zones affect the Japanese people on the West Coast. So basically, this is what they said. If you are of Japanese descent, you are not allowed to live in this area. They wanted to move all of the Japanese away from the West Coast. There was fear that the Japanese would help, the Japanese Americans would help the Japanese Navy perhaps invade the United States. Our fleet had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. There was basically nothing to stop the Japanese Navy from invading the West Coast. On February 20th, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare becomes America's first U.S. Navy flying ace of the war. So 2 months into the war. On February 22nd, General MacArthur transmits a direct order, General Marshall transmits a direct order to General MacArthur in President's name, ordering MacArthur himself to turn over command of the Philippines to a subordinate and to report to Australia to assume command of the large American force being built up there. So the orders came down, get yourself on a boat and get down to Australia. This was February. On February 23rd, a Japanese submarine fires 17 high explosive shells on an oil refinery near Santa Barbara, California. Fortunately, it did little damage. So this is 2 months after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are blasting the West Coast. On February 24th, the Voice of America begins broadcasting around the world. On the 25th of February, the Battle of Los Angeles, over 1,400 anti-aircraft shells are fired and an unidentified slow-moving object, it was probably a balloon, in the skies over Los Angeles. So it's the middle of the night. The appearance of the object triggered an immediate wartime blackout over most of Southern California, with thousands of air raid marshals being deployed throughout the city. At least 5 deaths are related to the incident. Despite the several-hour-long barrage, no airplanes were shot down. On February 27th, the USS Langley, which was the Navy's first aircraft carrier, its attack by 9 Japanese bombers while it was carrying P-40 fighters to Java. Langley is so badly damaged that she has to be scuttled, sunk, to avoid falling into Japanese hands. On March 4th, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launch an unsuccessful attack carried out by 2 Kawashina flying boats against Pearl Harbor. This is the longest distance ever undertaken by a 2-plane bombing mission. So here's what they did. They took these planes over to the Marshall Islands, and then the planes flew to a little island just west of Hawaii, and they rendezvoused with a Japanese submarine, and they refueled the planes. Then these 2 planes attacked Hawaii and flew back to the Marshall Islands. That was the plan. Finally, on March 11th, Douglas MacArthur escapes from the Philippines with his family and key members of his staff. They're evacuated by a PT boat in the middle of the night from Corregidor in the Philippines, totally surrounded by Japanese forces. It was a very, very dangerous, daring mission to get him to Australia. On March 12th, American troops land on New Caledonia to build a base and garrison the island. This landing includes the first Navy Seabees. The Seabees are a naval construction battalion, and their name comes from the C and B in construction battalion. That's where we get Seabees. Turns out my next door neighbor here in Indiana is a former Navy Seabee. On March 17th, the Nazi German Belzec extermination camp opens in occupied Poland. 434,508 people are killed here during 1942. On March 18th, Franklin Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9102, creating the War Relocation Authority, which becomes responsible for the internment of Americans of Japanese and, to a lesser extent, German and Italian descent, most of them legal citizens. So here is the instructions, and if you read it, it tells these families in May they basically have to pack up. All they can do is bring things that they can carry. No furniture. It all has to fit into a suitcase. No mattresses, but they can bring their own pillows and sheets and things like that, and clothes. And so 130,000 Americans of Japanese descent are ordered into these camps. This is a picture of what one of the cards looks like if you were of Japanese descent. And it tells you where you're going to be. This man was in Tule Lake. And this child was somewhere in Minidoka. Now let me show you what the United States set up. So here's the exclusion zone. Nobody of Japanese ancestry or descent was allowed inside this area. And they set up these camps, assembly camps, relocation camps, isolation centers, detentions, army internment camp, training facilities, federal prisons. Throughout the United States, they set up all of these different locations, and 130,000 Japanese Americans are placed in these camps throughout the United States. They were so afraid that these Japanese Americans were going to aid the Japanese Navy in invading the United States, they put them all in camps for several years. On March 20th, after being forced to flee the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur announces in South Australia, quote, "I came through and I shall return." And he did. On April 9th, the Bataan Peninsula falls. 75,000 American and Filipino forces surrender to the Japanese army under General Masahiro Homma. So this is Bataan. Here is Manila. This is the Philippines. And it's this peninsula. So the Americans were forced all the way back, and finally there was no place else to run, and they had to surrender. I know this area. I was in the Navy, made 5 combat cruises to Vietnam. My ship, the USS Enterprise, we were located here at Subic Bay, right next to this city of Olongapo. So I am familiar with the Bataan Peninsula. I've been there dozens of times. The Bataan Death March. American and Filipino prisoners of wars are forced to march some 65 miles. During the march, some 15,000 soldiers are killed by severe physical abuse and wanton killing. The general that was in charge of this was later tried as a war criminal after the war and hanged. So they were captured and they surrendered here, and they marched them 65 miles to these prison camps in Capas. On April 18th, Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle leads a bombing mission against Japan. So this is 4 months after Pearl Harbor. Along with 79 airmen of the U.S. Air Force, they were flying 16 B-52 Mitchell land-based bombers. Now, these are big bombers. They have no business being on an aircraft carrier. They take off from the USS Hornet in the Pacific Ocean some 700 miles east of Tokyo. 13 of the B-25 bombers fly over Tokyo and drop their bombs on oil storage facilities, factories, and military targets. The other 3 B-25s drop their bombs on Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. All but one of the B-25s run out of fuel before reaching friendly forces in western China, and they are forced to land in Japanese-occupied China. With the support of Chinese farmers, 71 airmen reach free China. 8 airmen are captured by the Japanese, who execute 4 of them in retaliation for the raid. This is Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. And so here was the plan. They intended to sneak up within a couple of 100 miles of Japan. Unfortunately, they wanted to launch here, but a Japanese submarine spotted them, and so they had to launch hundreds of miles quicker and further away than they wanted to. So they took off here, they bombed their targets, and then they continued on into China. But they all ran out of fuel. One of them actually landed in Russia. Okay? I mean, look at this. These are B-25 bombers. I served in the Navy. I was the chief nuclear reactor officer on the USS Enterprise, an aircraft carrier. I am stunned and amazed that they were able to take off from an aircraft carrier with these big, lumbering, cumbersome bombers. It just boggles my mind that these big old B-25 bombers were able to take off from a carrier deck. Unbelievable to me. On April 25th, 18-year-old Princess Elizabeth, who became queen, registers for war service as a mechanic, and she didn't receive any special privileges whatsoever. It was interesting to read that she went home to her castle every night to sleep, but the next morning she was back in uniform serving as a mechanic. I respect that. I mean, she could have been hiding somewhere in England, safe and sound, but here she was running around London as a mechanic. On April 26th, the German Reichstag, which was their parliament, meets for the last time, dissolving itself and proclaiming Adolf Hitler as, quote, the supreme judge of the German people, granting him the power of life and death over every German citizen. On May 7th, on Corregidor, the last American and Filipino forces in the Philippines surrender to the Japanese as directed by General Wainwright, who was the overall commander. And this was the end of the American and Philippine resistance. On May 15th, a bill creating the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps is signed into law, and thousands of women joined the army. Now, they didn't serve in combat, but they did a lot of other dangerous jobs. On May 20th, the first African Americans are enlisted in the United States Navy. So the Navy had been totally segregated until now, May 20th, 1942. On May 21st, Mexico declares war against Nazi Germany after the sinking of a Mexican tanker by a German submarine just a few miles off of Key West, Florida. These are pictures of some of the Mexican airmen. On May 30th and 31st, the British Royal Air Force Bomber Command's Operation Millennium. It's the first 1,250 bomber raid against Cologne, Germany. And as you see, they totally destroyed the city. The only thing left standing was the great cathedral, which I've been to, and it's beautiful. 1,250 planes all taking off and bombing one city. On May 31st, a Japanese midget submarine infiltrates Sydney Harbor in Australia in an attempt to attack the Allied warships. These little submarines, I think it was only a two-man sub, they were actually used in Pearl Harbor. They tried to sneak into Pearl Harbor, but we caught them and sank them. And they also sank them in Sydney. On June 1st, back in the United States, the Grand Coulee Dam is finished on the Columbia River. On June 4th through the 7th, the Battle of Midway, an American naval victory, one of our first victories, finally halts the Japanese advance in the Pacific. As they say, we had our aircraft carriers. And this is a picture of one of the largest Japanese battleships, which was sunk. So finally, for the first time, the American Navy won. On June 21st, a Japanese submarine, I-25, surfaces off the coast of Oregon and bombards Fort Stevens at the mouth of the Columbia River. The fort itself is not damaged, though a nearby baseball field is destroyed. And here you see a man standing in a hole made by one of the bombs. What they were after is Fort Stevens had these big guns, and they were to protect the Columbia River, but they didn't hit any of these guns. But still, it rattled people because here's a submarine bombarding the West Coast. On June 23rd, the experimental German nuclear reactor L4 has an accident, becoming the first nuclear accident in history in Leipzig, Germany. What's scary about this is if the Germans had been successful, they would have developed the atomic bomb before we did, and the war might have ended entirely differently. On July 3rd, on Guadalcanal, which was occupied only by the native Solomon Islanders, it falls to the Japanese naval construction forces deployed to construct an airfield on the island. So the Japanese took over all of these islands in the Western Pacific, and the Americans and the Allies had to go island by island to take them back. Guadalcanal being one of the bloody battles of the war. On July 4th, the United States 8th Air Force inauspiciously flies its first mission in Europe using borrowed British planes and bombs targets in the Netherlands. 3 of the 6 aircraft return. A year later, my father, Bob Reese, would be in the 8th Air Force. He was a B-17 gunnery instructor during the war, stationed in England. On July 6th, Anne Frank's family goes into hiding in an attic above her father's office in Amsterdam in a warehouse. They were Jewish, and the Gestapo was rounding up all of the Jewish people and sending them into concentration camps. So they hid in this attic. On July 18th, the German test fly the Messerschmitt Me-262, which was one of the very first jet fighters in the world. A few years later, my father, a B-17 gunner, received credits for shooting down a Messerschmitt 262. About 400 of these planes were shot down during the war. On July 30th, the SS Robert E. Lee, an American ship, is sunk in the Gulf of Mexico by a German sub U-166, which is itself sunk by the American escorting patrol. So they sank our ship, but the Navy ship escorting them sank the German sub. And this is all in the Gulf of Mexico. Several hundred ships were sunk by German submarines in the Gulf of Mexico. On August 7th, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps start the first American offensive of the war with an amphibious landing on the islands of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. So finally, a half a year after Pearl Harbor, America starts the island hopping campaigns, island hopping across the Pacific, headed for Japan. On August 16th, a military blimp left San Francisco Bay on a routine submarine spotting mission. A few hours later, the airship wandered back over the land and crashed with nobody aboard. The crew was never found. The life preservers and the life rafts and everything were on board. No idea what happened to the 4-man crew. On August 23rd, the Battle of Stalingrad in Russia. German forces of the 16th Panzer reached the suburbs of Stalingrad. So Hitler decides to invade Russia. Apparently, he didn't read his history books because he would have known that Napoleon tried the same thing and he was unsuccessful. And eventually, the Battle of Stalingrad was won by the Russian army, but it was one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. On September 9th, a Japanese float plane drops fire bombs on Mount Emily near Brookings, Oregon. in the first of two raids. This is the first bombing of the continental United States. Fortunately, Mount Emily, there's nothing there, so they just bombed this wooded mountain. They did damage a high school, but no one was killed or injured. On September 10th, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron begins operations in the United States. These were women who were trained as pilots, and what they did is they became flight instructors, training other men how to fly fighter planes and bombers, and they also ferried planes back and forth. So they would take these bombers and they would take off from San Francisco and fly them out to Hawaii, or they would fly them from a factory in New Jersey down to Florida. This left the male pilots to actually fight in the war. Very brave women. As I say, they were flying instructors. They trained our servicemen how to fly the fighter planes and the bombers. On September 27th, both the commerce-raiding German auxiliary cruiser Steyr and the American Liberty ship SS Stephen Hawkins sink, following a gun battle in the South Pacific. Steyr is the only German commerce raider to be sunk by a defensively equipped Allied merchant ship. So these commerce raiders, these were German ships. They looked like regular civilian tankers and cargo ships, but they were heavily armed. And what they would do is they would sneak up on Allied shipping and blow them out of the water. Well, the Allies, the Americans and the British, started arming our own merchant ships. And this is a case where our merchant ship sunk their commerce raider. On October 2nd, the British cruiser Curaçao collides with the cruiser liner Queen Mary, which was carrying troops from the United States. And this happened off the coast of Ireland, and the Curaçao, I don't know, how do you pronounce that? It sank and 338 men drowned. This ship is significant to me because my father went from New York to England on the Queen Mary when he was being transferred to the 8th Air Force in England. So he actually went aboard that ship along with 5,000-6,000 other soldiers to cross the Atlantic. This is interesting. On October 28th, film actor Errol Flynn, who was a big name in Hollywood, he was accused of statutory rape by 2 teenage girls. He was acquitted. On November 8th, Operation Torch, elements of the Allied Expeditionary Force, 105,000 men under General Eisenhower, land simultaneously along the coastline of Morocco and Algeria in North Africa. So in November, the Americans finally arrive in Africa to take on General Rommel. On November 12th, the Guadalcanal campaign, a naval battle near Guadalcanal, starts between the Japanese and the American forces. A huge battle. On November 23rd, legislation approves the United States Coast Guard Women's Reserve to help fill jobs and free up men to serve during the war. They are known as the SPARs, Semper Paratus, always ready. On November 26th, the movie Casablanca premieres at the Hollywood Theater in New York City, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. On November 28th, a fire in the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston kills 491 people. On December 1st, gasoline rationing begins in the United States, and these are some of the posters that were posted all around. Have you really tried to save gas by getting into a car club? My tank's in the war too, and I'm running it fair and square to protect your share. We sell gasoline only if you have a legally issued coupon properly endorsed. Help us smash the black market. Think, sailors have died to give you this ride. Be fair. So we needed to conserve gasoline because we needed it to fight the war. On December 2nd, the Manhattan Project, which was this massive secret effort to build the first atomic bomb, below the bleachers football stadium Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, a team led by Enrico Fermi initiates the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. So this is actually a squash court underneath the bleachers at this football stadium at the University of Chicago. And this was the very first successful nuclear reactor. This is significant to me because I ended up teaching mathematics at the U.S. Naval Nuclear Power School during the Vietnam War, and I was the chief nuclear reactor officer aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. So this is a piece of my own history. On December 7th, and how ironic, 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the battleship USS New Jersey is launched at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Pearl Harbor basically wiped out all of our battleships in the Pacific. They all were sunk at Pearl Harbor. On December 17th, the Allied issued the joint declaration by members of the United Nations, the first time they publicly acknowledged the Holocaust. On New Year's Eve, December 31st, the Times Square Ball in Times Square, New York, is not dropped for the first time. Instead, there is a moment of silence at midnight, followed by the sound of bells playing from sound trucks at the base of the One Times Square building. How emotional that must have been for the people. So on a lighter note, who was born in 1942? I think you'll recognize all of these names, most of them. Stephen Hawking, one of the world's renowned physicists and cosmologist. Muhammad Ali, that's not the name he was born with. He was born with the name Cassius Clay, but he eventually changed it when he converted to the Muslim faith. The great singer Carole King, her two big songs, You've Got a Friend and It's Too Late. Wayne Newton, who became a huge mainstay in Las Vegas later in life. The fabulous Barbra Streisand. Need I say more? The great country western singer Tammy Wynette. Stand by your man. Harrison Ford. Lee Greenwood, the country folk singer who is best known for the great song God Bless the USA. Martin Scorsese, the great Hollywood director, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, The Wolf of Wall Street, some of the biggies. President Joe Biden, born in 1942 during the war. Jimi Hendrix, one-of-a-kind guitarist, performer. Harry Chapin, one of my favorite singers, Cats in the Cradle, Taxi, WORLDDDD. Some guy by the name of Paul McCartney, he was some British group, I think it was called the Beatles. Yeah, that guy. The fabulous Aretha Franklin, RESPECT, respect. So, what was introduced in 1942? DDT came out that year, and now we're trying to get rid of it. Duct tape, and it was invented by a woman, Mrs. Vesta Stout, and she worked in an ordnance plant in Dixon, Illinois, and she was wrapping these packages, and they weren't staying together, so she thought, well, we need some kind of a waterproof tape, and she ended up inventing duct tape. Napalm, invented in 1942. Aha, penicillin. Thank God this came out. Probably saved thousands of lives of injured soldiers during the war. I'd never even heard of this thing. The Atanasoff Berry computer. It wasn't much of a computer. It was basically the first machine that could do mathematical calculations. It's sort of the guts of what modern computers are today. Aha, Kodacolor color film from Kodak. Super glue. This was almost an accident. They were trying to make plastic gun sights for the Army. And what came out of that was this stuff called super glue. From May 1942 till the end of the war in 45, the United States had a nationwide speed limit of 35 miles an hour, and it was called the victory speed limit. Once again, we're trying to save and conserve gasoline for the Army. Calvin Graham was a 12-year-old boy, and he enlisted in the Navy in 1942 by lying about his age. He forged his mother's signature. He and his brother stole a stamp that they needed to stamp on his application. He put stuff on his face so he looked older, looked like he had a beard. During World War II, he was awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart and other medals. They were taken away because he was underage. But President Jimmy Carter approved all of the medals except his Purple Heart to be reinstated. And his Purple Heart was reinstated in 1994. A 12-year-old boy enlisted in the Navy, and he was assigned to the USS South Dakota, which is a battleship. And during an attack by Japanese planes, there was an explosion, and he was seriously injured by shrapnel, and he's bleeding. But he didn't abandon his gun. He kept on fighting, even though he was seriously injured, and that's why he was awarded the Bronze Star, which is given for bravery in combat, and a Purple Heart. 12-year-old kid. God bless him. Audie Murphy. The Marines rejected Audie Murphy for being too short, and the Navy rejected him for being too skinny, and the Army reluctantly accepted him but did not want to send him into combat because, quote, he looked so young. Audie Murphy, the most highly decorated American ever. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he won all of these medals, and he turned 19 at the end of the war in 1945. Unbelievable. He was kind of one of my heroes. All my buddies and I, we loved the movie To Hell and Back, which was based upon his autobiography. Audie Murphy, America's most highly decorated soldier. Too young for the Marines and Navy. The original painting of Washington crossing the Delaware was destroyed by a British bombing raid in 1942. Why? Well, the painting was in a museum in Bremen, Germany at the time. So this famous painting, Washington crossing the Delaware, was totally destroyed. It was painted in the 1880s. Fortunately, the painter also made 2 smaller copies, and one of those copies is hanging right now in the White House. But the big original was blown away in a British bombing raid. President Gerald Ford worked as a male model in his late 20s, and he was featured on the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine in 1942 wearing his Navy uniform. Good-looking guy. Now, they changed the color of his hair, but here he is. Here's your president. Yeah. Pinball machines were banned in New York City in 1942 as lawmakers considered them similar to gambling, and they were stealing money from kids, so they banned all the pinball machines in New York City. The 1942 Rose Bowl football game was actually played in Durham, North Carolina, due to fears of the Japanese attack on the west coast of the United States. So here we are, the Rose Bowl. Duke Stadium, transferred for this year to Durham, North Carolina from the Pasadena Rose Bowl. And it cost $4.40. That's how great the fear was of the Japanese attacking our west coast. When the USS Juneau was sunk in November of 1942, all 5 brothers of the Sullivan family from Waterloo, Iowa, were killed. So all of these brothers were on this ship, and the ship was sunk, and all 5 brothers died. This ship is the USS The Sullivans, and it was launched in 1995 in honor of those 5 brothers. Bing Crosby's 1942 recording of White Christmas was so popular that he had to re-record it 5 years later using the same musicians and the same backup singers that he used in 1942, because the original master had become so damaged due to its frequent use. So they had the master, and they kept making records and records and records, and the master was damaged. We didn't have digital recordings back then, so he had to go back into the studio and record it again to make a new master. That's how popular that song was. And White Christmas is still one of the if not the all-time best-selling records ever. Hollywood actress Carole Lombard was visiting her hometown in Indiana in 1942, and in one night she raised $2 million in war bonds, which is about 35 million today. She died in a plane crash on her return home, due in part to a lack of airport lighting turned off to conceal American airstrips from the Japanese. So once again, we were so afraid of being invaded on the West Coast, they turned off the lights in airports. And one of our big stars was killed. The Saviola Cavaliera, I'm sorry for my Italian, charge. Many consider this as history's last significant cavalry charge. It took place on August 24th of 1942. 700 Italian cavalrymen attacked and drove back over 2,500 Soviet soldiers armed with machine guns and mortars. Can you imagine attacking machine guns and mortars on horseback? Tea was so crucial for morale in the British Army that in 1942 the United Kingdom bought the entire world's crop of tea. Ludmila Pavlichinov, I'm so sorry for my Russian pronunciation, Pavlichinok. She was a female Russian sniper with 309 credited kills, and she was brought to America and was touring the United States in 1942. Of course, the press was more interested in her appearance, and they wanted to know if she wore makeup on the front lines. Yeah. I'm guessing makeup was not a big deal to her, just by judging by this picture. 309 sniper credit kills. Very lethal lady. Life expectancy in 1942 was 64.7 years for a man and 67.9 years for a woman. Today we're in the 70s. So what were the top grossing movies back in 1942? We still went to movies even though the war was raging. Bambi, Walt Disney's classic, was the biggest moneymaker of 1942. Mrs. Miniver, starring Walter Pidgeon and Greer Garson, came in at number 2, biggest moneymaker. Yankee Doodle Dandy, starring James Cagney, came in at number 3. It's the story of George M. Cohan. Woman of the Year, starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Now there was a dynamic duo, big names back then. Once Upon a Honeymoon, Cary Grant and Ginger Rogers. What were the most popular songs of 1942? What did we listen to? White Christmas, number 1 song of 1942, and is still played millions and millions of times every Christmas to this day. Glenn Miller's I've Got a Gal in Kalamazoo. Jimmy Dorsey's Tangerine. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Cocktail. Harry James and his orchestra, He's My Guy. The average annual salary in 1942 was $1,880. In today's dollars, that's $37,205. The actual average salary in America today is in the $70,000 range. So that's a pretty meager salary. A gallon of gas cost 16 cents back then. In today's dollars, that's $3.17 a gallon. Not that cheap. A new car costs somewhere around $1,385. But by the way, they stopped car production in 1942. We needed all of the factories to be producing war machines and tanks and jeeps and ships and airplanes. Anyway, that would be a $27,400 car in today's dollars. Still considerably cheaper than the average car price in America today. A movie ticket costs 35 cents. Today's dollars, that's still cheap. That's $6.93. A new house costs $3,779. That would be a $74,000 house. That's a very inexpensive house, even in today's terms. What were the 5 most popular radio shows back then? Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, a ventriloquist act. The Jack Benny Show. The Chase and Sanborn Hour, variety show. The Pepsodent Show, starring Bob Hope. And The Guiding Light, a soap opera. What were the most popular musical groups of 1942? And you're going to see a pattern here. The Glenn Miller Orchestra was the number 1. The Harry James and his Orchestra. Kay Kaiser and his Orchestra. Jimmy Dorsey and his orchestra. And sure enough, number 5, Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra. No solo acts. The orchestras were the big thing in 1942. So, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something you didn't know about 1942. Be well.